For several days now, chaos had reigned in the camp. The royal guard tried to boss around the hunters, who resisted and rudely sent the most intrusive commanders to hell. The king was bewildered, but officially, the Hunters Guild did not answer directly to the highest authority, so His Majesty could do nothing about it. Monsters emerged from places they were least expected. The losses in the first few days filled the king with holy terror. One monster could wipe out an entire squad before it was even shot or wounded. With the arrival of hunter squads, things got easier. They began teaching the soldiers the basics of fighting monsters, things even their apprentices knew. The hunters themselves had it very tough. By the time the regular army units arrived, they had already despaired of holding back the onslaught of enemies. 5 cities lay in ruins because they couldn't handle the wave of creatures drawn by the scent of human lives. The squads evacuated all the residents, blocked all paths, entrances, and exits, and when the monsters appeared in the city, they set it on fire from all sides using a special flammable liquid created by their alchemists. Any creature that managed to escape the fiery hell set by the cunning humans was immediately destroyed by vigilant hunters. This was the only way to avoid massive losses among the civilian population. The hunters themselves perished one after another. Thorin barely kept up with accepting the rings of the fallen and recording the losses. Entire teams, along with apprentices and assigned groups of evacuees, didn't return. Rumors spread with terrifying speed. The claims of unrest at the border with the High Witches were not confirmed, but a wave of terror and panic swept through all the border villages and towns, sending refugees flooding into the cities. The receiving cities couldn't provide all the necessary resources quickly enough, and the streets were plagued by robbery and looting. However, by His Majesty's decree, those caught in such acts were executed without trial, simply hanged on hastily built gallows, and the crime rate sharply declined. After the dissolution of the Holy Order, people walked around completely lost, not knowing what to do next now that the closest followers of the gods were just as susceptible to passions as ordinary folks. However, after one squad returned significantly battered, rumors flared up that the devil himself had awakened, and now this world was doomed. The Lord of the Abyss had supposedly unleashed his chain dogs demons with flaming fur, fire bursting from their enormous maws. In reality, one of the largest volcanoes on the fiery land had awakened, and disturbed salamanders began appearing in port cities. Nothing good came from this. Monsters the size of large calves, resembling lizards, but with rudimentary wings and mouths full of needle-like teeth, left smoldering ruins in their wake. Adult salamanders could breathe fire jets up to 20 feet long. Eldora, the first and last line of defense, now resembled a snarling wolf ready to pounce. Defensive fortifications bristled with steel fangs, signal fires burning day and night, marking the direction for refugees who hadn't yet made it behind the protective walls. Blacksmiths from all over the country flocked to the border town. Terrified by the grim prospects, people tried to help the army and hunters as best they could. Alfred, working non-stop for 4 days in his relative's forge, felt that this terrible unknown state of constant tension would never end. Sometimes he thought it would be better if the monsters started their attack, showed themselves. Facing an enemy made it easier to gather one's courage and oppose them. But the alien creatures sensed the pervasive fear, slid like gray shadows around the impregnable walls, their emerald eyes flashing in the heavy darkness. But they didn't come closer, as if deciding to make their prey step out to meet them in desperation. The forge door thudded dully, letting in cold autumn air and the smell of frost-bitten earth. 2 men appeared in the haze of warm air escaping from the forge. One was broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a pleasant face. A good sword hung at his belt. The other was significantly younger, dark-haired but light-eyed, dressed simply. In his hands lay a thick book in a battered binding. "Master Alfred, I presume?" The man's voice was low with a noticeable rasp. Steel notes slipped into it, and the blacksmith realized this man was used to commanding and having his orders immediately obeyed. The blacksmith cautiously nodded, set the hammer aside, and crossed his arms over his chest, scrutinizing the newcomers. "It wasn't easy to find you," the stranger said with some annoyance, untying the strings on a small travel bag. "I'm here on behalf of a mutual acquaintance. The bird sent to you couldn't find its recipient, so he preferred to send everything necessary through me." Alfred frantically ran through everyone who might do such a thing. Only one fit all the parameters, and knowing the nature of the sender, the blacksmith was ready to grab a weapon or just lie down in a coffin and close the lid. The man, meanwhile, pulled a folded, heavily wrinkled and dirty piece of parchment, seemingly smeared with dirt, from his bag and handed it to the blacksmith. Alfred hurriedly unfolded the message and read the lines penned in familiar flowing script with disbelief. Then he looked up at the strangers in bewilderment. "And what am I supposed to do with this? As much as I wish to eliminate the threat of these devil-sent monsters, I can't magically conjure up the materials for those arrowheads he describes," he protested, shaking the much-abused paper. "Where am I supposed to find that much silver? I'm not a wizard. You—" "Thorin!" the man interjected. "Master Thorin? From the Hunters Guild?" "Master Thorin," the blacksmith repeated sarcastically, almost mocking. "Can you find me Barghest stomach stones for this alloy? Or wyvern fangs? Maybe salamander scales?" Thorin glanced at his companion, who irritably pursed his lips and handed him a small leather pouch. "Have you considered just throwing Godwin to the monsters?" Alfred snorted derisively, peering inside the pouch. "I swear he'd wipe them all out in a week, and then start complaining that it wasn't enough." Thorin barely suppressed a broad grin. Alfred seemed to know the hunter well. "Is that all?" the blacksmith inquired. "Yes," the master nodded. "Everything you need for the work will be delivered this evening. The sooner these arrows are in service, the better for us. At least we'll be able to man the walls with anyone who can shoot. It seems these arrowheads only need to penetrate a monster's body to destroy it, even if the wound isn't fatal. Oh, and Godwin asked to give you the help of one of the Holy Order members." Alfred's eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at the master, who grimaced as if in pain. The young man hiding behind the broad shoulders of the headhunter stubbornly stared at the floor. "Yes, I was surprised too," Thorin said with frustration, hopelessly waving his hand. "The order was disbanded, most of its members arrested. They're in royal dungeons now, but I managed to take a few at Godwin's request. He claims their abilities will be useful to us." The blacksmith barely stifled a knowing laugh. The hunter had managed to torment his hated enemies even here. What could be more humiliating than obeying the blasphemous Hunters Guild and enchanting weapons? Judging by the flash in the young man's eyes, defending the faith in torture chambers was preferable to helping hunters. Moreover, such a situation lowered the power of the holy word to mere sorcery, which priests fiercely fought against. Alfred shrugged. He had no choice. They had to use everything that could help against the advancing monsters. The man glanced at the young man clutching the book and snorted. "Don't be shy, come in. We'll be working together for a long time." The priest flushed, glaring angrily at the blacksmith, but said nothing. Thorin smiled and left the forge. A cold wind blew a handful of fine snow into his face. The master clenched his teeth and, wrapping his cloak tightly around him, hurried towards the guild. A dull worry and an inexplicable feeling that the seasoned hunter eventually recognized as fear gnawed at his chest. 3 teams that had sent birds notifying they were escorting villagers to the city had not yet returned. The weather was against them. In the snowy blur of the early blizzard, nothing was visible, and the night creatures could sneak up quietly and unnoticed, giving no chance to survive. Thorin silently glanced at the sky, shrouded in dark clouds, and shivered. Empty streets, the whisper of death breathing down his neck, dark gaps of tightly closed windows, shadows dancing in the flickering torchlight, swift, mocking, sneering. The gods do not care about this world's troubles. Snow fell in a solid wall on the pavement, and the hearts of the living grew cold with anticipation. The first snow of the month, brought by the changing wind from the northern provinces, caught them off guard. Avon with his team was escorting residents of 2 villages to Eldora, and despite the hunters' almost endless patience, their nerves began to fray. Winter months never favored them with good weather, but when the sky was overcast since morning, the wind mercilessly whipped, tearing down hoods and frightening the horses with its bass hum through the bare branches, and threw handfuls of road dust into their faces. A treacherous ache started. By evening, small snowflakes fell from the darkened clouds, scraping their bellies against the tree crowns. Then large flakes began to fall slowly. The wind puzzledly quieted, occasionally whining underfoot. The roads turned to mud in a matter of hours. Already inconvenient paths turned into a slurry of mud and water, disgustingly squelching under the horses' hooves, which sank into the mire up to their hocks, throwing their heads up and pricking their ears uneasily. "Damn it," swore Bjorn, a burly, bear-like hunter, when his horse, a powerful buckskin mare, stumbled and nearly threw the rider into the mud. "Bag of manure." The mare snorted indignantly and struck the puddle with her hoof, splashing mud around. Bjorn irritably jerked the reins, forcing the horse to raise its head and sit back on its haunches. If he wanted, the mighty man could break its neck with one jerk. Such was the strength hidden in this man's body. Among his comrades, his nickname stuck. Bear, earned during one of the raids in the winter forest. The team was tracking a ghoul, and Bjorn had the misfortune of running into a bear. Silence had to be maintained strictly, and the smell of blood could attract other monsters, so the hunter strangled the bear with his bare hands in front of his team's eyes. When ignorant people saw the formidable weapons of this hunter, 2 butterfly axes with blades sharpened on both sides, their knees trembled not only at the sight of his powerful arms and bull neck adorned with a red-black tattoo. "Stop torturing the beast," Edwin the One-Eyed commented phlegmatically, adjusting the quiver on his back and pulling the hood lower to shield himself from the falling snowflakes. The beast shook its wet head in agreement and moved forward, pulling Bjorn by the reins. The one-eyed hunter, covering his empty eye socket with a strip of black velvet like a robber chief, was unusually calm and prudent, spoke little, preferring to act more. Unlike his teammates, he first reached for his bow, from which he could pierce a butterfly with 4 arrows in a few moments from 400 paces. Avon glanced at his comrades and sighed heavily. This was the most unbearable part of their work, to deliver the residents safely under the wall's protection. But saying it was much easier than doing it. They dragged along all the stuff they could carry and couldn't, carts loaded to the brim, creaking sadly and threateningly, tilting sideways at every noticeable bump. If the team was alone, they would have reached Eldora in a day's march. But now they had been on the road for 2 days, moving at an unacceptably slow pace. A loud scream, accompanied by wailing and the death rattle of wood breaking from overload, made the team nervously pull up their horses and grab their weapons. In a few moments they discovered the cause of the loud, desperate cries. A cart dangerously tilted, and some of the carefully guarded belongings ended up in the muddy dirt under the horses' hooves. The owner ran around the unfortunate vehicle, waving his arms and wailing. His wife and 2 children, shivering with blue lips, stood aside, wincing in distress. "Curse you all!" Avon swore and dismounted. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Eldwood, his apprentice, starting to move closer to the teacher, but Bjorn held him by the elbow and dismounted with uncharacteristic agility for someone his size. The horse, lowering its head, hopelessly nuzzled the owner's hands, reaching out as far as the right shaft allowed. The broken left one had slipped from the leather loop and lay in the dirt on the ground. It turned out that on a slight descent, the rear wheel had slipped off the axle and, squelching, rolled somewhere into the bushes. One of the boys, obeying the barely perceptible frown of the dark-haired hunter, squeezed through the hedge and retrieved the runaway, getting thoroughly muddy and soaking wet. "They should have assigned soldier squads to them." Robert spat on the ground, flashing light eyes. "We have enough troubles without having to babysit these inept ones." The lady's favorite, spoiled and utterly impatient, but an excellent swordsman and talented strategist. And when a guitar got into his hands, all the hunters in the guild gathered in the dining hall, listening like mesmerized to the soft, low voice, flowing and rippling like a slow river. Now he impatiently ran his hand through his wheat-colored mane, brushing off the transparent drops that settled on the strands, and irritably banged his fist on the saddle bow. The chestnut stallion, accustomed to such antics, melancholically shifted from foot to foot and stood still again, like a statue. "Calm down," Edwin advised without malice, and stretched his legs, leaning back against the horse's rump. "We won't make it to the city today anyway, and that means we'll have to spend another night in the open. It's time to stop. It's getting dark. Hey, Avon, did you hear? Or do you want the horses to break their legs in this mess in the dark?" The team commander just shrugged, examining the split-cart axle. Edwin always gave sound advice, just not at the right time. He was nicknamed either the talker or the acrobat. What this hunter could do with his body defied all norms. However, monsters often got confused too, facing such a flexible and incredibly fast hunter who matched the creatures in speed and precision of movement. 2 short blades, which the hunter wielded with exceptional skill, had already made their owner famous, not only among his guild comrades. "Edwin's right," Avon admitted with a sigh, brushing his hands off. "Fix the cart by morning, or you'll either carry everything on your back or leave it here," he said, addressing the sullen villager. The man grimly nodded and began unharnessing the horse. His wife rushed to the cart and quickly pulled out 2 thin blankets, wrapping the shivering children in them. 24 villagers, quietly talking among themselves, efficiently began preparing to spend another night in the inhospitable forest. The weather showed no intention of sparing the weary travelers. Damp firewood burned poorly, giving off more smoke than flame. Eldwood, rubbing his watering eyes, got up and moved to another spot, away from the smoky stream. Bjorn snorted and shifted slightly, making room for the boy beside him. "Having a hard time, kid?" Logir sat hunched, hiding his cold hands under his cloak. The boy just sighed and bravely shook his head, fearing mockery from the relentless fair-haired hunter. But the swordsman seemed so tired that he just shrugged sympathetically and closed his eyes, instantly falling into a doze. Hunters knew how to sleep even on the move, when there was time and opportunity. Eldwood got up and slowly, hugging himself, walked over to Avon, standing outside the circle of light from the fire. The dark-haired hunter didn't move, still standing with his arms crossed, peering into the dense darkness. Nights were growing darker, and the darkness was growing stronger. It seeped into souls with chilling horror, entangled the mind with chains of fear, gripped the heart with merciless claws. Snow fell like a burial shroud on the frozen ground, patterns forming on wet cloaks, Light snowflakes softly fluttered from breaths, clouds of vapor escaping from mouths, and settled on hands as tiny drops of moisture. "Do you sense it?" the boy asked quietly, not expecting an answer. "It's very close, breathing down my back. But it's not hot like the living. Dead. Cold." Avon was silent for a few agonizing moments, as if he hadn't heard his apprentice's words. "The wind carries the stench," he said hoarsely, trying to pierce the impenetrable darkness with his gaze. "The monsters are close, and they're following our tracks. Can we protect them?" The boy nodded towards the fires, where the villagers huddled in a futile attempt to warm themselves, and a shiver ran through his thin body. "I don't know." The master's voice was astonishingly quiet. There was no point in lying and giving false hope when death had already chosen its targets. A pathetic 5 hunters against an unknown number of monsters, fast, strong, smart, and burning with hatred for all living things, especially those who could oppose them. The boy quickly returned to the fire, where the hunters were calmly and methodically preparing for battle. None of them knew if they would survive the night, but each was ready to fight for the right to live against those who came into this world uninvited. "Eldwood," Edwin the One-Eyed grabbed the boy by the shoulder and peered intently into his calm face. The mask, hiding the terror of a future that might not come. "Whatever happens, don't move away from the fire. They fear the fire." The boy nodded, his pupils unnaturally wide. "I remember, Edwin." "That's good." The archer approvingly patted the boy on the back and took up his bow. A weak gust of wind, frightened and dying down, brought to them a hoarse gurgling from the monsters' throats, the faint rustling of cautious steps, and beyond the light's boundaries, pale green lights of hateful eyes began to flicker here and there. Eldwood swallowed, and somewhat awkwardly pulled from its sheath the bastard sword forged for his hand. The bright steel with silver inlays reassuringly winked at its owner with a glint from the firelight. The bowstring snapped, and the silence erupted into a chorus of howls. Edwin the One-Eyed never missed. People screamed in terror, clustering around the fires like a flock, staring in horror at the hostile darkness that extended its grasping tendrils toward the smoldering embers of life. "Stay close to the fire," the boy's mind echoed as Bjorn dashed forward, axes flashing, cleaving through monsters that seemed to appear out of nowhere, splitting tough skulls, crushing bones, and hurling heavy bodies aside. "Stay close to the fire." The twang of the bowstring resonated in his temples as broad-headed arrows unerringly struck the creatures from the dense wall of living death that surrounded the defiant, life-clinging humans. "Stay close to the fire." The furious hiss of 2 short blades whistled in his ears, and Edwold rapidly slashed through the darkness with precise, swift blows, leaping, dodging, slipping between snarling jaws, the steel biting into armored hides. "Stay close to the fire." The desperate wail of the monsters pierced his heart, transitioning to a gurgle as the gleaming steel in the hands of the grinning, fair-haired Loagir slashed through alien lives and hissed triumphantly, bathing in black, steaming blood. "Stay close to the fire." The sword in the mentor's hand sang a grim funeral song, weaving patterns in the air, reflecting the fierce flashes of the flames, growing into a humming wall between monsters and men. "Stay close to the fire." The death rattle of the bear, collapsing onto the blood-soaked ground with a torn throat, echoed in his ears. The clanging of broken blades in Edwold's hands, instantly felled by a monster unnoticed by him, howled with despair. The twang of Edwin's broken bowstring, staring senselessly at the dark sky with dead eyes, sobbed. The dulled steel of the long sword fell with a plaintive clink onto the frozen clods of earth, slipping from loosened fingers, and golden hair, matted with blood, scattered over the snowy shroud. Death crept quietly, barely touching the neck before recoiling back, gasping and convulsing, when the bloodless bastard sword first claimed an unlife, only for the yellow eyes of the next monster to glint obstinately again. Pain flared up and almost immediately faded, allowing him to feel alive for a few more moments and hear the cries of the dying people, left without even the paltry protection they had. And then everything went dark, swept away by the relentless darkness, impatiently closing in from all sides. The sky sprinkled snowflakes, weeping with flakes of wet snow, softly laying on the blood-soaked frozen ground, carefully covering the last resting place with a weightless white veil, burying the taken lives. It would keep this secret for a long time. Shibet Shirenbarg. The slow, flowing speech touched deaf ears and seemed to awaken something in his chest. His heart pounded dully. Once, twice. Somewhere at the edge of his consciousness, searing pain stirred, but it reached him as if through a thick shroud. His body felt entirely foreign, motionless, cold, and unresponsive. He didn't even immediately feel the cautious touches, which at first warmed his cold skin and then started to burn with hot sparks. He managed to open his eyes with difficulty. His eyelids were heavy, as if filled with lead. When he finally succeeded, a moment of horror washed over him. He was blind. But then the darkness gradually began to dissipate, lighten, and he could make out the outlines of two figures bent over him. One of the vague silhouettes abruptly straightened, lifting its head, and disappeared from view. Shavishan Bilan, a low velvet voice distorted with contempt. His vision slowly returned, and the silhouettes began to take shape. Emerging from the fog, the features of the one standing nearby became clear. Dark, almost black eyes framed by long, thick lashes. Shimmering porcelain skin, smooth and velvety. The curve of sensual lips, now bitten as if in worry. Flowing golden hair cascading in locks over fragile shoulders. He wanted to leap up, forgetting about the pain, to absorb the beauty that had revealed itself so suddenly. "Calm down, human." A voice like silver bells seemed to embrace his shoulders, making him obey. "You are too weak. Hold on a bit longer." Now he felt the cold, piercing to the bones. Icy, merciless. But even this pleased him. If he felt it, it meant he was still truly alive. From the hands of the unusual girl, waves of warmth spread, lingered where the pain twisted like a raging basilisk, soothing, relieving the torment. After some time, he managed to prop himself up on his elbow and quietly groaned at the sight before his eyes. Bloody snow, soft as down, covering sightless eyes, broken bodies, scattered fire logs, and icy metal blades glistening. A guttural growl escaped his throat instead of words. He rose despite the pain, swaying, reached the frail body, and collapsed to his knees, touching the upturned face with tightly closed eyelids with undying hope. His fingertips burned with cold, and he pressed his forehead to the frozen chest in despair. Warm hands gently embraced his shoulders, making him pull away. "The weak always perish first, human." The silver bell's whisper was quiet. "I could have saved them," he spat out with dry lips. She just shook her head, and the golden hair rose like a weightless cloud. "Your right to live is not yet exhausted, human." The low voice struck his bare nerves, making him flinch and lift his eyes. The other figure was tall, broad-shouldered, with stunning chocolate eyes framed by snowy lashes. His snow-white hair was braided into a plait thrown over his back. Inhumanly beautiful and equally dangerous. High witches. "Avon," he whispered as understanding finally dawned on him. "My name is Avon." Since they had left the citadel, Godwin hadn't spoken a word. He just silently urged the horses forward, not responding to Robert's questions or surprised and confused outbursts, trying to elicit any emotion or response from his friend. Cale saw the worry, longing, and fear in his gray eyes. Deeply hidden, suppressed, but still existing. It was hard to believe that a witcher could be afraid of anything, but it was an undeniable fact, and this fear had gripped his soul, not allowing him to breathe freely. "Godwin," carefully choosing his words, Cale stopped the man by the stallion from which the witcher was removing the bags while Robert fussed with the fire. "What's going on? Where are we going? We are being led. But I don't want to feel like a blind kitten being dragged to the nearest pond on a string." Godwin looked at him with heavy eyes. A feeling of being cornered and hopelessness had settled in them. He stood silently for a moment, turned, slung the bags over his shoulder and walked to the fire. Cale could only clench his fists. The witcher was being stubborn, and it would be impossible to get a word out of him. The nighttime cold was so intense that even the fire, burning all night, despite attracting unwanted attention, couldn't warm them, and Cale unsuccessfully wrapped himself in a travel blanket. Godwin had disappeared nearly 2 rotations ago and still hadn't returned. Robert was seriously worried, noticeable by his tense posture and constantly wandering gaze on the dark wall of trees. After another quarter hour, the werewolf sniffed the air, sprang up, and vanished into the night mist without a sound. "There you are!" Robert caught the flashing fist. Sneaking up on Godwin was hazardous to one's health. "Ran off like a scorned girl? What's going on?" Frankly, the witcher's silence scared Robert no less than Cale's seriousness, who kept his scrutinizing gaze fixed on Godwin. The werewolf felt that the boy had changed significantly in just a few days. The childish enthusiasm and naivety had disappeared from his eyes, replaced by a certain maturity, confidence, and calmness. In some ways, this young man became a counterbalance to Godwin's temper, and when he saw them together, it gave the impression of 2 halves of a whole. And the werewolf noticed that the witcher, though trying not to show it, protected the boy with fatherly care. "Go to hell!" hissed Godwin, yanking his hand out of the werewolf's grip. Robert raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Go to the abyss. Every patience and loyalty eventually comes to an end, once the invisible line is crossed." Robert's fist flashed in the darkness, but the witcher was faster. He caught the hand, struck below the elbow, and twisted it to the point of cracking, causing the werewolf to groan in pain, turning his back to the witcher and bend over. He felt the witcher's disheveled hair tickle his bare neck. Despite the cold, the werewolf, due to his beastly nature, didn't feel discomfort from leaving his jacket by the fire. But now, without the additional protection of well-crafted, dense leather, Robert felt weak. Because the being standing behind him was immeasurably stronger, suffering, and therefore angry and hateful. "Gain some strength, lowly one, before you dare challenge me." The snake-like hiss and uncovered rage in the voice made werewolf hair stand on end. This was not Godwin. It just couldn't be him. Robert felt the hostility of the being behind him, full of rage boiling in its chest, ready to harm anyone, even a friend. "Godwin, what?" A blow to the lower back made him collapse to his knees. Sparks flashed before his eyes, and a burning pain pulsed in the back of his head, spreading motionlessly down his spine. "I said shut up." The voice had changed. Feeling that he was no longer being held, Robert struggled to turn and froze in amazement. Godwin tore off his necklace and sank to the ground, clutching his shoulders with his hands, He was shaking violently, his eyes tightly shut, and his lips bitten to blood. "Damn," the werewolf whispered hoarsely, staring at his friend curled up on the ground. All the anger at the Witcher evaporated in an instant, replaced by pain. Not pity. Robert knew how much such a thing irritated Godwin. But pain. For this unbearable Witcher, who had gotten himself into another venture causing him suffering, for the reckless hunter friend who had taken on too much. Cale appeared quite suddenly, and Robert even thought that the boy was probably watching. As practice showed, his curiosity always outweighed even the sense of danger. The red-headed young man was next to the Witcher, and not at all afraid of the Witcher's unhinged state, hugged him by the shoulders as if he were a small child. To Robert's mute astonishment, Godwin not only didn't kill the boy on the spot, but didn't even push him away. He just froze, like a statue. "Damn it, I can't do this anymore." The low growl echoed through the night forest, and the Witcher began convulsing. Cale recoiled in fright. Robert had no idea what to do. Godwin's silver eyes changed, gleamed with gold, and the pupil narrowed to a slit. It smelled of death. Before them stood the dark Witcher, the evening star. "Come here, bastard." The growl rolling in his throat stopped his breath. Before Cale could be amazed at whom the clearly deranged Godwin was talking to, the question resolved itself. "I've been wondering when you'd notice me." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. A figure materialized from the darkness, and a man stepped into the flickering firelight among the trees. A head taller than Godwin, broad-shouldered and lean, as agile as a weasel. Dark copper hair, styled in a complex fashion, glowed with a fiery light, and honey-colored eyes were full of hatred. Thin lips twisted in disdain as the newcomer glanced at the trembling Godwin. "You are pathetic, Godwin," he spat. "You can't even close yourself off to avoid feeling the pain of those humans you love so much." "I didn't curse myself," the Witcher hissed, clenching his fists. "You betrayed us," the other Witcher shrugged. "You made your choice, so now pay for it." "Which I am doing," Godwin snorted, gradually regaining control over his body. "But I can't understand what you, Meridian, are doing here." The flesh-tearing pain had slightly subsided, crushed only by the force of his will. But it wouldn't last long. Too close to the border with Etheria. Too tightly bound he was by unbreakable ties to this land, dying from the invasion of foreign creatures. And the Witcher felt its pain as his own, unbearable and utterly beyond his control. He felt it just as he felt the death of each hunter, experiencing the moment when the soul leaves the body with each of them. But the closer to the border with the lands of the High Witches, the weaker the magic of the amulet, slightly dulling the torment. Such was the curse imposed on him by the Prince of the Evil Court, sealed with the lives of a dozen witches killed in that battle by Godwin's sword. "You understand everything?" The White Witcher grinned, and even the eerie smile didn't mar the beautiful face. "Killing you has become a matter of honor for many of us." Godwin laughed, mockingly, making his enemy pale with rage, and so contagiously that Cale himself didn't notice that he was chuckling into his fist, and Robert barely restrained a wide smile. The uncontrollable charms were beginning to take effect. "What honor are you talking about, Meridian?" he asked after laughing. "Surely not the one that drove you to strike from behind. Admit it, you just aim for the vacant place." The enraged opponent said nothing, just darted forward, pulling out a gleaming blade from its sheath. So fast and imperceptibly that Cale thought he had simply disappeared and reappeared already very close to Godwin. The hunter sprang from his spot, dodging the whistling blade. His weapon remained by the fire, strapped to horse's saddle. Colorful strands of magic flared, and the White Witcher leaped aside, barely catching the long, transparent whip with his sword. Its end whistled over the Dark Witcher's head, howling as it cut the treetop and scattered into shimmering dust. "Let's get out of here," Robert hissed, grabbing the frozen Kale by the elbow and dragging him away from the scene of the fight. But Godwin... The acolyte tried to protest, but the werewolf unceremoniously grabbed him by the scruff and shook him so that his teeth clattered. "Leave him be," the werewolf snorted. "We'll only get in his way, and maybe he'll vent his anger and calm down." Meridian attacked from below, with a long, upward diagonal strike, trying to reach his opponent, but Godwin easily bent, letting the blade pass by, slipped forward, ducked under the enemy's arm, and struck the elbow hard while simultaneously attacking with a force wave. With a wet crunch, strong bones broke, and the White Witcher was flung aside, stunned, crushed, with shattered ribs. He didn't have time to get up. He felt a foreign hand on his throat, and he was lifted from the ground. The Witcher barely opened his eyes, suffocating and trying to pry the iron grip with his broken fingers. Godwin standing before him hardly resembled a human. They can't be so beautiful and so terrifying at the same time. Godwin hadn't yet taken his combat form, but one look into his blazing, mad, inhuman eyes was enough to lose all self-control. "You've gone completely mad, Godwin," the defeated one croaked, feeling one arm hang limp after a short strike from the Witcher. "Exactly," the Evening Star drawled with indescribable pleasure and squeezed his fingers slightly. The White Witcher convulsed, desperately clinging to life. "Does it hurt?" Godwin almost sympathetically asked. "Do you know how many years I've lived with pain? It has become a part of me, inseparable, never ceasing even for a moment. Here," he touched his temple with a thin finger, "and here," his hand almost tenderly rested on the fallen enemy's chest, causing a brief flash of pain that clouded his consciousness. "And do you know how many of you there have been? Wanting to prove that you are stronger than the Evening Star. You can't even take combat form." He tried to say it disdainfully, but a wheeze came from his crushed throat, and the phrase sounded pitiful. "I can't use my full strength in human form." Godwin winced in annoyance, baring his long fangs and jerking his victim closer. "Do you want me to tell you what happens to power when it's not used? It burns out, Meridian. It burns my patience with a fire rushing through my veins, searing my mind with pain. And then you realize that you can't think coherently, can't breathe. You can only curl up in a desperate attempt to survive this torture." The fingers on the throat continued to squeeze relentlessly, and everything swam before the White Witcher's eyes. Life was leaving his perfect body. "But the worst thing is that I keep sensing you," Godwin hissed, and madness flashed in his now golden eyes again, sliding across the iris with crimson sparks. "Those like you, following my tracks like hounds, not letting me forget what I did. What you call betrayal, and a change of priorities. Maybe those damned priests were right, and beings like us shouldn't exist." Madness and rage fully possessed the soul of the Evening Star. Godwin could no longer control the power bursting from the depths of his essence, could no longer handle the clouding of his mind, which he had held back for so long. The longing and unbearable pain spread through his chest, making it impossible to breathe, hindering even his vision. Enough. The desperate scream pulled him out of the murky shroud of oblivion. Kale, pale, disheveled, with a long scratch on his cheek left by a flexible twig of a bush he had pushed through, had slipped from the firm grip of the werewolf and stood very close to him, watching Godwin with wide, terrified eyes. That look, full of fear, sobered the Dark Witcher for a moment, but only for a moment, as rage flared up in him with new force. Indeed enough, he smiled, baring his teeth like a rabid wolf, and he clenched his fingers, squeezing the breath out of his helpless opponent. The lifeless body slumped to the ground in a grotesque heap, not even resembling a once-living being. Godwin brought his hand to his eyes, clenched his fist, and turned to the frozen boy, who stood speechless, his disbelieving gaze fixed on the White Witcher. He tilted his head to the side, examining the acolyte with detachment, somewhat curiously, but with a certain predatory greed. "I see your soul," he purred, and in one swift movement was next to him. "They call me the Soul Hunter for this very reason. I can take it from you, and it will give me enough strength to scatter the remains of the prince into gray dust. Do you want me to grant you such an honor?" "Enough," the boy repeated, looking firmly into the blazing, mad eyes, and suddenly slapped the unsuspecting Witcher. Godwin recoiled, pressing his hand to his burning cheek in confusion, his eyes quickly changing, filling with lunar silver. They flared with horror, darting to the lifeless body of his opponent. And the Witcher collapsed backward, losing consciousness, right into the arms of the silently appearing bogeyman behind him. Lying there was warm and comfortable. His aching body, like a beaten dog, whimpered pitifully and refused to obey. Every limb seemed filled with the heaviness of lead. His head buzzed. Memories of what had happened were almost non-existent. Only rare fragments of images and sounds flashed before his closed eyes. "He'll freeze." A voice reached him as if from afar, muffled and slightly frightened. "I've already given you all the blankets." The irritation in the speaker's tone nearly made him smile. "But he's cold." The speaker lightly touched his forehead, and for a moment he wanted to pull away. How he hated when someone touched him. Other people's hands felt like spider legs to him, leaving a disgusting sensation, sticky like insect webs. Witchers were always too perfect to be loved. People could only lust after them, or hate them, fiercely and openly. But this time, the desire to withdraw flickered and disappeared. The touch carried no threat. On the contrary, the hand was warm, gentle, and the concern for Godwin's condition was genuine. He managed to open his eyes after an unknown number of attempts, and immediately regretted the rash decision. The light from the fire stabbed his eyes, causing them to tear up instantly. "He's already awake." Robert leaned over the stirring Godwin, scrutinizing him closely. "You won't attack anyone else, will you?" A hand shot out from under the blanket, grabbed the bogeyman's collar, and gave it a good shake. "Godwin," the werewolf said reproachfully, carefully unclasping the fingers clenched on the shirt collar. "I'll knock you out again. You're so quiet when you sleep facing the wall that I almost believe you're an innocent creature." A mocking snort was the response. "Brave bastard." But in his eyes was the most genuine fear. He must have remembered what he nearly did. Godwin was indeed scared. Scared that he had lost control, that he couldn't manage the madness smoldering in the soul of every wicked one, almost committing the irreparable. No. Killing people was nothing new to him. He was accustomed to it and indifferent to the blood that had once stained his blade up to the hilt. People were imperfect beings, but there was something in them that always attracted him. Perhaps it was the short time they were given, in which they accomplished far more than the immortal higher witches. Perhaps their ability to love fiercely and hate just as intensely. Perhaps that very soul the Archbishop spoke of. He had long despaired of understanding why he had stood in the way of the prince that time, sacrificing his life for the insignificant fates of two mortals. He tried to become one of them, tried to comprehend all they did and, most importantly, why, but suffered a crushing defeat. Pretending to be human was easy. Humans were blind, unable to see beyond their noses, but becoming like them was an impossible task. Yet he saw his salvation in this. The curse was laid upon his witcher essence, and if he could change himself so much that the charm would have no choice but to let go. It was foolish to hope for this, to sincerely believe and listen with bated breath to himself. Today, all that he had so carefully driven inside had flared up and burst out in death, and Cale had almost died, though he didn't understand it. In his eyes, the hunter saw no fear or disgust, only concern and deep sympathy. It was because of this that Godwin wanted to howl out loud, to unleash the pain, but nocturnal concerts under the moon were the prerogative of werewolves and ghouls. Even Robert was looking at him strangely. Godwin could swear that everything happening in his mind was reflected on his face. And if anyone, his friend could always understand what was on the hunter's mind. The acolyte fussed around the fire, rattling a camping pot, muttering something under his breath. It was so amusing that Godwin couldn't resist and with difficulty raised himself, feeling the aches in his bones. Although Robert and Cale hadn't noticed, Meridian had hit him multiple times, breaking bones, dislocating joints, and now his body was slowly regenerating itself. By morning he'd be fine, and the hunter would stop grimacing with every movement. The boy finally managed to fix the slightly bent handle of the camping pot, scooped some out, and handed a cup with hot brew to Godwin, who sat up on his bed, pulling his legs under him and wrapping himself up to his ears in the donated blankets. The hunter carefully took the cup and suspiciously sniffed it. What if Cale was just pretending and had decided to poison the witcher to prevent future incidents? However, Godwin suspected that the acolyte's culinary experiments were just as effective as a specially made poison. The steam rising from the hot liquid smelled of bitter winter grass and a ground root commonly called bisogon for its calming effect. Godwin smelled something else and couldn't identify what exactly, but the pleasant spicy aroma didn't arouse any suspicions. So he took a cautious sip. The brew tasted more unpleasant than its smell suggested, but Godwin suppressed the grimace that nearly crossed his face. He didn't want to offend the boy. "Who was that?" the acolyte asked casually, glancing at Godwin from under his bangs. He didn't expect an answer, but the tense silence and half-truths surrounding the hunter annoyed him. The acolyte was convinced that if they were heading for the same goal, the man shouldn't have secrets that could cost his companions their lives. And today's incident was just further proof of that. Cale didn't fully understand what the attacking witcher had said, but one thing became clear. Godwin had done something in the past for which he was now paying, and curiosity persistently demanded at least a small part of the information about what had happened. After all, the dark-haired man was not ordinary. He couldn't be called a higher witcher because of his strange attitude toward people, but he couldn't be called human either, because of his essence, completely contradictory and incomprehensible. Cale even flinched when Hunter's voice sounded dully in the complete silence. Godwin's recollections, a few years before the main events. "Look, you'll get in trouble, Evening Star," she laughed, and playfully poked his shoulder with her open palm. "The prince is used to me causing problems," the witcher chuckled, burying his face in the thick silk of her golden hair and inhaling the scent of freshly cut grass with pleasure. "Besides, tomorrow is the great hunt, and all mistakes are forgiven before it. A bond between a white and a favorite of the dark court is a mistake." She raised her thin eyebrows and trustingly laid her head on his shoulder. "For that, They usually excommunicate from the court or kill without trial. You're living in the past, Eleonora. Godwin kissed her temple and squeezed her narrow hand, gently stroking her slender fingers. Half of the High Court sneaks off to see your kind. Opposites attract, you know. She said nothing, only sighed with some sadness, and released a handful of weightless seeds into the light breeze. The wind, like an obedient creature, glided along her delicate wrist, picked up the gift, and joyfully soared upwards, carrying new life with it. The higher witch tossed her hair back over her shoulder and stood up gracefully. Swift, elegant, beautiful. He always admired her. Her beauty was unlike the exotic, but dark allure of the wicked. She seemed to glow from within. Perhaps he, mired in bloody intrigues and internecine wars, desperately lacked this light, pure and warm. Dawn will break soon. The girl threw back her head, momentarily freezing as she looked at the brightening sky. I must go. He rose after her and easily waved his hand. The dense air whipped into streams, twisted into lashes, and next to him, a wind spirit pawed the ground obediently. Godwin. She looked down at him from her mount, and in her dark, almost black eyes, a certain sorrow lingered. Be careful during the great hunt. He nodded and slapped the silvery steel steed on the haunch. The sylph leaped forward, soaring in a long jump, and in moments vanished from sight, carrying the golden-haired rider away. Come out already, the Witcher said irritably over his shoulder and shook his jet-black hair. There's nothing worse than spying on the one you desire. Dripping with venom, hiding your rage, but not daring to challenge. You're like a jackal, Meridian. The White Witcher appeared almost immediately, as soon as Godwin let him know that he had sensed his presence long ago. He curled his lips in contempt, looking at the evening star. What I saw here is not like our usual games with the White Witches, Godwin, he sneered. You know the rules, especially if they concern someone chosen by the prince himself. Get away from me, Godwin snorted, or you'll stain my boots with bile. I didn't agree to take on the burden of ruling. I have more interesting things to do than dealing with the likes of you. Undisciplined bastards whose word isn't worth a dime. Meridian paled with each word. Genuine hatred flared in his honey-colored eyes, the kind that drives one to reckless actions, like attacking the evening star at the peak of his powers. But Godwin was wrong. Meridian hadn't come here because of Eleonora. He had come only because of Godwin, because of the evening star. Godwin didn't even bother drawing his weapon. He simply lashed out with his hand, adding a touch of Varia, and the White Witcher was thrown aside, shattering his broken blade into pieces and dragging him across the ground. Dazed, he could barely move, let alone resist. Meridian, how many times is this now? The dark-haired man mused without moving from his spot, his silver eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Fifth? Have you learned anything at all from your experiences? You suffered defeat time and time again, yet stubbornly continue to try and kill me. Do you want me to give you a few lessons? Maybe that would increase your chances. Kill me, the Witcher hissed, struggling to rise from the ground, spitting blood, and standing unsteadily on trembling legs. Why do you always leave? The last words were almost a scream, filled with all the pain accumulated over many years. Years spent in the shadow of the hated evening star. He had everything: respect, love, power, a high position in the ruthless society of the wicked, beauty that few could rival. And it was this that gave him everything else: the higher witches, creatures willing to give anything to behold beauty. Their concept of perfection and its meaning differed greatly from mortal perceptions. They had no desire to possess, but they revered what amazed them. Meridian was one such being, mercilessly destroying his competitors and firmly holding his position. But his entire familiar world collapsed in an instant when Godwin appeared at the court. No one knew where the prince had found him. One day, alongside the returning ruler from the great hunt, stood a dark-haired witcher with spellbound silver eyes. And Meridian realized that this time he had nothing to oppose the stranger's power. He didn't immediately understand that the fire ignited in the depths of his soul was not hatred, not blind rage, but admiration, inexplicable, bordering on madness, driving him to prove he was stronger, to erase any mention of the once existing Godwin from the face of the earth. Because you're not worth it. The cruel words stung like a whip, and Meridian bit his lip until it bled. "Don't leave," he whispered desperately, feeling his body start to disintegrate from what was happening in his soul. "Why do you never watch as you destroy everyone around you?" Godwin was suddenly right next to him, and Meridian felt his breath. Thin fingers grasped his face, lifting his head by the chin, and he met the gaze of those silver eyes. There was no hatred in them, no anger, only sympathy. This feeling was almost unknown to the wicked, and this discovery so stunned the copper-haired that he froze, unable to move. "You can't last long on just hatred, Meridian," Godwin said softly. "Find something else to draw strength from, or you'll burn out." Brightly, but quickly. He patted him on the shoulder as if they were friends, summoned a wind spirit with a single movement of his hand. Every lower, regardless of their court affiliation, would do anything for a single approving glance from the evening star, and swiftly left, leaving the copper-haired in confusion and bewilderment. "Envy is not the best feeling," Cale remarked thoughtfully, shivering and moving closer to the fire. Godwin measured him with his gaze and, with a sigh full of regret, handed him one of the blankets. The boy gratefully grabbed the offered item and immediately wrapped himself in it, leaving only his nose poking out. "It's not envy, Cale." The hunter shook his head, thoughtfully watching the bright tongues of flame. Robert snorted distrustfully. "Then why couldn't he leave you alone?" He threw more logs into the fire, and the flames joyfully purred, growling deeply like a well-fed cat, sinking their teeth into the thick oak log. "Because he couldn't forgive me for my defeat." The dark-haired man smiled grimly. At that moment, nature froze as if before a storm. The lull, akin to a deathly, deceptively calm sleep, enveloped the earth, causing everything to freeze in fear. For at the very edge of hearing, the unshod hooves of black horses were already thundering, racing faster than the wind. The phantom hunt. It is said that the wicked choose human souls as their prey. Rabid dogs rush ahead, poisonous saliva dripping from their jaws, and their fur blazing with a bright, bloody fire. The cursed pack of Cdwn Anun. Anyone who hears their howl, filled with longing for the hunt, is doomed to soon depart for the shadow world. A storm cloud trails them across the sky, bristling with scarlet flashes of lightning. It presses the trees to the ground and uproots them, tearing them apart and scattering them in all directions. The roar and deafening whistle of whips, the laughter of crazed spirits, and the soul-chilling songs of the wicked, leading the great hunt, just as terrifying as they are beautiful in their deadly beauty. And piercing the air like a gleaming blade is the low, thunderous call of the hunting horn, summoning all magical creatures to join the annual game, the phantom hunt, to chase the prey, catch it, and carry it away to the spirit world. Anyone foolish enough to encounter the great hunt will never return to the living world. They are doomed to join the ranks of vengeful spirits, endlessly roaming the earth, lost in boundless malice, or disappear forever, devoured by the bottomless jaws of the phantom hounds. Only then did he allow the nature of the Dark Witcher to take over, releasing the carefully restrained beast and surrendering himself to the overwhelming sense of complete freedom, freedom from all rules and limitations, letting his madness reign. Not everyone returned from the phantom hunt. That was when any disputes and quarrels were resolved, battles raged between the strongest, the defeated were left in the dust behind the great hunt, and the victor and the exhilarated spectators rushed on. This time, everything was different. He almost missed the moment when they went too far. A cart overturned in the path of the mad horde, with dead horses torn apart in an instant by the phantom pack of CW and Anun. An old driver, whose eyes clouded with deathly horror as soon as his soul's strength was absorbed by the satisfied prince. And two children, a freckled boy and a timid girl hiding behind her brave brother, who looked death in the face. And something inside him wavered. It flared up, burning the remnants of reason with a blazing flame, flashing like an icy blade, stopping the spear thrown by the prince. He saw in people what was inaccessible to beings like him, a light, sometimes dimmed, but sometimes blindingly bright, called a soul incomprehensible and unattainable for higher witches. Humans lived their short lives with such a thirst that couldn't be found among the magical folk. Their motives remained a mystery to the Evening Star, but he wanted to understand them, to get closer to the secret shrouding their souls. And he simply couldn't destroy two defenseless beings, whose hearts shone in the enveloping darkness like two warm stars, curled up trustingly in their chests. Godwin. The ruler was as astonished by his successor's actions as Godwin himself. The Witcher only shook his head desperately and slipped forward, shielding the mortals with his own body. Alone, against the phantom hunt, and hundreds of crazed beings thirsting for blood. That was the first time the Dark Court saw the true power of the Evening Star. Blades sang in his graceful hands, piercing flesh, slashing phantom souls, banishing, destroying with no right to return. Flames of spells roared and hummed, wondrous and unusual in the new shades of mortal desires and passions, and the higher beings retreated in awe, unable to overcome the madman who had betrayed them for the sake of pitiful mortals. The prince knew Godwin's weaknesses, but he sincerely wanted Godwin to come to his senses, to remember who he was. But his patience snapped when, with a careless gesture, the Evening Star brought Morin the Stormy, swift and beautiful, to the ground. The ruler struck, mercilessly, cruelly, pouring all his wrath into the incantation of banishment, drawing power from the severed lives of his subjects. He couldn't save those children. He remained on the ground, wretched, dying, his soul burning with the curse, in a mortal body. But they didn't leave him alone. Their amazement was too great. Year after year they hunted him, tracking him like a rabid beast, unable to forgive their blind adoration. His blade was bathed in silver blood, and his heart hardened as his hands repeatedly took the lives of those who were his kin, not by blood, but by strength and soul. The curse tore at his flesh and spirit. The mortal shell drained his power, and pain drilled into his mind, clouding it, but he held on. Gritting his teeth, clenching his fists, he fought forward, refusing to give up. The campfire fell silent, timidly shrinking to the ground and creeping from the log to thin twigs. Cale silently watched the flames, cowering down, like a beaten dog, and felt his hands grow cold. Robert glanced at Godwin, huddled, shivering, his gaze vacant, and his fingers clenched into fists of their own accord. A life for a life, pain for an attempt to save. This world was rotten, and did it deserve what this witcher was doing for it?